Welcome everybody to this fireside chat entitled the European Microfinance Award 29 Retrospective Client Resilience to Climate Change. My name is Sam Mendelson. I'm a financial inclusion specialist at the European Microfinance Platform, and I'm the lead author of the annual paper on the European Microfinance Award, which last year was called Adapting to a New Normal on Strengthening Resilience to Climate Change. I'm joined here by Frédéric, who is a postdoc researcher at the Institute of Development Policy at the University of Antwerp. He studies the role of microfinance in the advancement of the cattle-driven agricultural frontier in Nicaragua, and in his PhD thesis, he looked at the topic of green microfinance from a political ecology perspective. I'll leave you to read more about him on the session page. But it's easy during this pandemic to let the urgent crowd out the important, and to forget that before there was COVID and after it's gone, which it will be, the greatest challenge everyone is facing in the world is climate change. And this is especially true in low-income countries for underserved, vulnerable communities and households who are not only faced with the biggest threats, but they also live in countries least able to afford the protection and adaptation that they need. So financial service providers, and MFIs among them, can and are increasingly playing a critical role in strengthening client resilience. And the European Microfinance Award last year was a fascinating tour of who is doing what and what lessons can be learned for others. Today, I'm going to start with a few very quick slides to cover the topic and the award, a little primer. And then Frédéric and I, we're going to talk about the 10 semi-finalists, and among them, the 3 finalists from that award. And we're going to go back and forward and talk about what was interesting about each of those initiatives. And then we'll have a little bit of time to talk about a couple of other points, and we welcome Q&A. So please do put comments or questions in the chat, and where possible, be specific with a question, whether it's to me on the process or the paper, or Frédéric on the subject more broadly, I would suggest. So I'm going to share. Right. So a little bit about the European Microfinance Award. I suspect that many of you came straight here from the ceremony for this year's award, and so you will know that it's been going since about 2005 and has been annual since 2014. It's 100,000 euros for the winner and 10,000 for the 2 runners-up. And each year it's on a different topic. But what it has in common is it looks for applications from organizations that are active in financial services around the world and that are innovating in a particular area of financial inclusion. It is we make no apologies that it is a rigorous multi-stage application and evaluation process. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that after. So the topic last year, as you know, was strengthening resilience to climate change. What do we mean by resilience? We all know what the word means. But in this context, it really refers to systems being climate-proofed for the future. It's the capacity of different systems to adjust in response to the climatic stimuli they're seeing and the changes in processes, practices, and structures to minimize the damage or to benefit from opportunities associated with climate change. The source for that definition you can find in the paper. So what can FSPs do about this? Well, they can do a lot. They can offer various financial and non-financial products and services, loans, savings, insurance, education, and other technical assistance to help vulnerable people adapt to a changing climate, safeguard livelihoods from increased frequency and severity of natural disasters, rainfall patterns, pestilence, among others. So this is briefly how the process worked last year, and you can see that it's multi-stage. We had 41 applications, 20 in the short initial round, 26 of those went to the longer, much more detailed application, which requires audited financial statements, letters of support, extensive quantitative and qualitative data. 18 of those went to an expert selection committee, of which 10 semi-finalists were chosen, of which 3 finalists, and of which a high jury announced the winner, which was APA Insurance Limited of Kenya. This is the list of organizations that we are going to talk about today. And then a little brief mention of the paper that really frames a lot of these issues, and I recommend to you if you want to get deeper into the subject. This paper, called Adapting to a New Normal, talked about the context of climate change, the different challenges for financially excluded populations, examples of what different providers can do to strengthen clients' resilience to the effects of climate change, 10 case study examples of different types of initiatives, and the factors in their success. Each year after the award finishes and before the EMFP team that produces this paper writes the paper, we have to think about how to map out the initiatives we saw. What do they have in common, to silo them? And last year we saw that there were three main approaches to climate change. The first is increasing resilience to the unpredictable and high impact external shocks. Examples of this would be protecting people from typhoons, the very severe shocks that will push vulnerable people into disaster. And the second is what we call the accretion of threats, the helping clients adapt to a changing climate. So this might be increasingly erratic rainfall patterns, plagues and pestilence, drought, flood, desertification, erosion, and the like. And the third, which we're not going to cover today because this session is really on client resilience, is on strengthening institutional resilience, because it is axiomatic that unless institutions are resilient, their clients cannot be as well. So, please. Right. Frédéric, hi. Welcome.
Hi. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Very pleased to have you here. So let us talk about this first idea now, the increasing resilience to the high impact external shocks. And a very good example of this is the typhoons that the Philippines is currently seeing right now. And resilience in this context is about protecting clients, their families, household businesses, and minimizing their losses. So why don't we talk about ascii from the Philippines, which is a very good example of this. And would you like to introduce ascii to the audience, please?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thanks, Sam. Yeah, the first initiative we look at is ascii, which was one of the 3 finalists of this award. And it's an MFI in the Philippines, which serves over 100,000 micro entrepreneurs, farmers, and fishermen in rural communities. And so, as you mentioned, the context in which they operate is one with a particularly high incidence of typhoons. And it's in relation to a few massive typhoons that took place in 2009 that they started working towards disaster preparedness and recovery. And they started developing a combination of products and practices which ranged from a disaster risk reduction manual to microinsurance and a resiliency fund based on savings. So from this, Sam, there are some particularly interesting things about this initiative to you.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me was the partnership with Oikocredit that ascii has, in which they created this very comprehensive disaster risk reduction guidebook. So there's an institutional memory there, and this can be used. This is in the public domain as well and can be used by others. And also there's a real diversity of products, isn't there? I mean, they have a resiliency fund, which is like savings. It's effectively a savings for insurance product, emergency loans, education, and yeah, it's just a real diversity, don't you think?
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to Agronomica Finance Corporation, because this is also in the Philippines with a similar context. So Agronomica is an MFI, and as of 2018, which is when they were reporting on this, they were serving a small number of clients, under 1,000, with a range of agribusiness loans. Climate change has had a significant impact on smallholders in the Philippines. They experience frequent crop losses, income volatility, and droughts and rains with increased pestilence and disease, soil degradation, crop failures. So in response to this, Agronomica partnered with Kenema Foods International, which is a local agribusiness company and cacao exporter, and has implemented a cacao lending program. This means that farmers can diversify their existing farming. That means mixing short-term crops and coconut production with new cacao trees and increase farm incomes through multiple crops. Additionally, the additional organic matter from the trees allows improvement in soil health and moisture. And the partnership here is interesting because Kenema provides the technical support, training and coaching to these farmers, and Agronomica tailors a 6-year cacao loan product in a quite considerable loan term, and tailors it to farmers' cash flows. What was interesting about Agronomica's initiative for you?
Yeah, I think you mentioned a few really important points there already. As you said, it's a much smaller initiative, for example, compared to the breadth of ascii. But it surely has a package that seems to allow to go really deep into their engagement with the smallholders. And I specifically wrote down the idea of the long-term financing. As you mentioned, it's a loan which covers a 6-year period, and where they really try to align the product with the cash flows of the farmers. So that's an important takeaway. And the focus on the diversification is also something to emphasize. Mixing the idea, so they enter with the idea of supporting cocoa, but it's also in combination with shorter-term staple crops, for example. And this diversification has, two objectives. As you mentioned, it's on the one hand for the quality of the soil in terms of water management, and then also the diversification at the level of income. So different ways of working towards that resilience. And then as a last takeaway of this initiative, mentioned there's that partnership so between the MFI and 2 other institutions that help with technical assistance, and together with their clients, they draw up some farm plans, and that's the way in which they look at that cash flow element. So I think those are the main takeaways for this.
Yeah, and that's right. And I like that it's both responsive to the underlying problem. It's proactive and reactive as well, isn't it? Like some of these are. Yeah. Let's talk about Vision Fund Myanmar next. Would you like to introduce VFM?
Yeah, definitely. So this MFI is one of the largest ones of Myanmar. It serves close to 200,000 women in rural areas and for agricultural purposes. And also here, we're seeing a context of increasingly extreme weather events, which include flooding, cyclones, tsunamis, and that made Myanmar one of the most exposed countries to climate risk in the past two decades. And the initiative that Vision Fund presented for the award is one which is actually also related to a global insurance program. And this is interesting because it can be seen as an insurance at the level of the institution more than at the level of the individual client. And Sam, maybe you can tell us something more about this insurance scheme.
Yeah, so this is called ARDIS, which is the African and Asian Resilience in Disaster Insurance Scheme. And yes, you're in a sense, it's a sort of it takes away the complexities of insuring end clients by insuring the institution, which triggers recovery lending in the case of a sudden shock. So there are economies of scale and the network effects that VFM has as part of the broader Vision Fund group. I find that very interesting, and also really very much a local implementation, but of a global initiative. Also sort of notable is that Myanmar has been until the last few years, a largely closed and therefore underserved market by the financial inclusion community too. So that was fascinating, and there's a bit more on how ARDIS works, because it's not immediately intuitive, but in the paper we go into some detail about how this model works. Let's, the last one in this section, let's talk about Tin Pong Microfinance Institution, which is also called TCM, from Vietnam. I'll tell everyone a little bit about that. So this is an MFI in Vietnam operating primarily in the coastal regions with about 150,000 clients as of a couple of years ago, mainly women. Lots of people working in fisheries, etc. And these clients are especially vulnerable to the effects of climate change, particularly the risk of increasingly severe storms and high dependence on fishing and reduced fish stocks. To support these clients and mitigate the risks also to the institution as well as to the clients, they introduced in 2017 a disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation program. The goal of this is to ensure sustainable livelihood of the women in the coastal regions. What's distinctive about this is TYM applies a two-way communications practice with its clients and gets extensive feedback from them, and really has an emphasis on prevention and institutional preparedness. At the time, 65,000 women were trained on disaster risk and climate change. And in most of the areas that it works, these women have established environmental protection teams themselves, and they're called broadcasters, who update others on weather situations, reminding them on how to proactively prepare and stuff. Yeah, Frédéric, what was interesting about this initiative to you?
Yeah, thanks for that. The first thing that I had noted down was what you said also about the communication and the fact that this program was based on a practice of intense communication with the clients. And there was a lot of emphasis on clients' feedback on the services of the MFI, and that was also how they switched to thinking in terms of a disaster risk reduction program. And they went, it seems to me, they also went beyond the communication with the clients and also organized other types of multi-stakeholder dialogues. And so they shared experiences and research findings with other actors around them to think about resilience to climate change. So I thought that was interesting, and also that they reached out to different institutions at the national level, I think also to other banks to be discussing this issue, and in that sense have a bit of some kind of advocacy also. So that was an interesting take on that the institution could take a role of advocacy. And then also through that process of capacity building that you mentioned, and the idea of the broadcasters, I think it's interesting to see how there's some kind of collective organization or movement that comes out of it. So that it's it really does something about movements on the ground, and I like that from this initiative.
Yeah, the sense of client buy-in, making them really part of this initiative and not merely recipients of information, but dissipators of it, and for them to become teachers in the representatives in the community as well is it's very appealing. Yeah, I like that too. Let's the organizations that we've talked about so far are in that first category of responding to the unpredictable or the high impact shocks. Let's now move on to the second category, and that includes the winner, and this is helping clients adapt to a changing climate. And so APA Insurance Limited was the eventual winner of the award for their insurance program. Would you like to tell us about it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, APA Insurance, the winner of last year, is one of the main general insurance companies in Kenya, and they serve about 650,000 clients across the country with a broad range of insurance products. And so part of their client segment now are also smallholder farmers, highly vulnerable to climate shocks. And this includes changing rainfall patterns with droughts and flooding. And so APA, in combination, in partnership with the Kenyan government and the World Bank, and with international reinsurers, and so this is an important part of it, the alliance, the platform that really built this. Well, together they developed an index-based insurance product to insure pastoralists and farmers' revenues, and that was based on an expected quality of grazing grounds and expected yields in certain areas. But maybe you, Sam, can tell us a bit more about specific innovative elements of this initiative.
Well, yes, there are two main index insurance products, and they're detailed in the paper. I won't go too much into them here, but what was really, I think, fascinating also for the high jury, which ended up selecting them, was this complex network of partnerships. Insurance is notoriously the hardest thing to do in financial inclusion. I think most people probably think that there have been many failures, and the successes have sometimes struggled on sustainability, and index is one of the ways to increase efficiencies, to reduce costs, to not have to do case by case assessments like this. But I think the fact that they were insurer in themselves makes them stand out. There have been very few insurance companies that have been applicants for the award. There are, I suppose, questions about long-term sustainability and how much of because there is subsidy involved here, but whether in the long term this can stand on its own feet is, I think, time remains to be seen. But the multiple insurance products that were clearly designed to be responsive very much to the context that the farmers are facing was one of the reasons I know it stood out for the selection committee and the high jury. Let's move on to ASA, Action for Social Advancement in India. This is a bit of a different case, and I'll give a little intro here. ASA is an NGO, and it partners with financial institutions to facilitate access to finance rather than providing the financial services directly, which wasn't an eligibility requirement, but this was the only one that did it this way, which was interesting. There are about 165,000 end clients of its partners, predominantly farmers, indigenous communities, and it supports them through the partners by managing the risks associated with climate change, poor nutrition, and economic disempowerment. Specifically, it has launched a solution linking the agrobiodiversity value chain. This means developing better conservation and management practices for clients, using stress-tolerant varieties of traditional crops, and the adaptation potential of diverse crop species in mixed production systems. It also means improving clients' abilities to process, produce, and commercialize these products. So I thought it was interesting because it really keeps the communities at the center. It's also interesting because it supports the institutions rather than the end clients directly. But what struck you about this?
Yeah, I second you on that. The first thing that I wrote down was also the fact that it's the only non-financial institution of the 10, and that's also good to have had this as part of the process of this award, to open up to some extent. As you mentioned, for APA it was an insurer, which was unusual, and here it's the fact that it's an NGO, and that opens up perspectives and possibilities also for alliances. So I think that was really noteworthy. Also, the engagement with the communities, as you said, I remember from their application that they paid a lot of attention and being very active in indigenous communities, wondering about how to relate to these areas. And in the selection also of specific seeds and crops, it's important to mention that they work with the local research institute also to engage with the question, okay, what type of traditional seeds could have the necessary characteristics, say, to be considered as better seeds, and really looking at the context, how does it work here, and not importing, for example, or imposing new types of seeds, which might happen in other contexts. So I think that was a strong element, and the fact that you said also to link it to a value chain approach. I had that agrobiology question on the chain.
I suppose it's the difference in a way between adapting and responding, isn't it? And the keys in the term. And this is really a case of helping clients adapt, not just weather the consequences of what's happening, but to prepare them to change, to take sort of behavioral insights as well, and understanding of agronomics to nudge people into different crop choices, different methods, different choices of seeds, to actually mean that they can live and even thrive in the climate rather than just dealing with it. That's what, I think that's what introduced. The next one we're going to talk about is actually, that's a good segue into FDL, because you know these guys very well, and I think it's only right that you should talk about this initiative, because this is really about changing the underlying context and not just responding to it.
Yeah, I agree, and it is the that I'm most familiar with. So we're talking about the Fondo de Desarrollo Local in Nicaragua, and the University of Antwerp has been working with them since they started in the early 90s. It's an MFI that serves over 60,000 clients in both urban and rural areas. They combine support for urban enterprise and rural agricultural activities. In the application, they discuss the context of climate change in different areas of the countries where you have changes in weather patterns in what is called the dry corridor at some area in Nicaragua, and also changes in temperatures and rainfall more in the central of the country. And unfortunately, since a few weeks now, the context today is also that of intense hurricanes, because the specific area in Nicaragua has been hit twice in 2 weeks now by a very heavy hurricane. So one of the key ideas behind the green products and practices of FDL and their partners in Institute Mitlapan is that they don't only want to increase the resilience of their clients, but also of the environment that they're working in and living in. And so that's that proactive approach that you were talking about, focusing on a combination of income diversification and the promotion of environmentally friendly practices like agroforestry or silvopastoral practices. And they do that with a mix of financial services, but also non-financial services like technical assistance. And they've been experimenting also with payments for ecosystem services. So some cash rewards conditional upon the adoption of certain practices. In terms of the technical assistance, I can say it combines an individual and a collective approach, which was interesting, and something that stood out in the application, I remember, and that comes out quite a bit when we're working with them, is the openness to think about the role of finance in certain broader dynamics of deforestation too. So really to think about, okay, what is our current role in certain broader dynamics, and how can we tweak that, not just looking at our clients, but trying to understand the broader context. But yeah, so I had already warned you that I was probably going to take a bit more time on this.
That's no problem. I wanted you to, and we'll come back to FDL a bit at the end, because I want to talk to you a little bit about the blog that you wrote in response after the award, and give you a chance to make that case a little bit deeper. So we'll leave FDL there and move on to a name that might be quite familiar to people listening, because about 34 minutes ago, they were announced as the winner of this year's award on encouraging effective and inclusive savings. They were a semi-finalist last year. Busy guys in Nepal. And a very impressive. Yes, and congratulations to Muktinath. Fascinating savings product on adapted solidarity models. But here we're talking about something different. So a little bit about Muktinath Bikas Bank. It's a Nepalese bank, served 500,000 clients as of a couple of years ago when this all happened. And Nepal is directly affected by the impact of climate change, especially droughts, landslides, and floods increasing, uneven rainfall, rising temperatures, hailstones, drought, and hurricanes are just some of the examples of things that have notably increased in recent years. the consequence of this is increased vulnerability of farmers' livelihoods, because they depend very much on the traditional climate calendar for farming, with very little protection. So what Muktinath did in response is design a microloan for improved climate smart agricultural practices. This initiative aims to minimize the effects of climate change on smallholder farmers through the use of different technologies and techniques. These include polyhouse, drip irrigation, varieties of resistant seeds. So a bit like the last couple that we talked about here, is trying to nudge farmers into different crops, different usage that are going to be more adaptive in a changing context. What is it? What about Muktinath's initiative do you like?
Yeah, the thing that stood out for me also here, as you said, it's in a way similar to a few others that we're talking about here, is that combination of financial and non-financial services, and doing that in partnership also. So you have a financial institution and then partnering with another institution for the provision of technical assistance, and doing that with the specific focus of supporting climate smart agriculture. Maybe a small side note that we maybe haven't mentioned, the specifics of climate smart agriculture being the idea of having three objectives, improving food security, mitigation to climate change, and adaptation to climate change. So that's a bit the idea behind climate smart agriculture. And maybe that's something that still more work needs to be done on sometimes, is to know, okay, when and how do we label certain activities to be really addressing these three objectives. But that's a general thought about this. It just came up now because we talked about climate smart. Another interesting thing about this initiative was that they mentioned that they had done a randomized survey to kind of look at the impact of the farming technologies that they were supporting, and it showed reduced losses of farmers for the farmers of 70%, and an increased reduction in income of 250% compared to a control group. So I don't know the specifics of the research, and I don't know how to interpret these results or how they did it. The only thing that stood out for me here was the idea that I really like, the one to go and look at what changes does this actually make on the ground. And I think there's definitely more to be said about how we look at the changes on the ground related to green products and practices.
And there's one other point that neither of us have mentioned here, which is the bank staff being trained by their partner in climate smart agriculture technologies is an approach that they're now replicating in their commercial lending as well. So this is an example rather of practices going from the commercial side down to the development finance side, but this has gone up, and they've got the climate smart improving agriculture loan in their commercial lending department is based on these understandings. So that's interesting too. We've got two more that we're going to talk about, and make sure we've got some time to cover some other subjects and comments. The first is the Fondesuco cooperative in Peru. Would you like to give us a précis of them?
Yeah, definitely. It's a Peruvian credit and savings cooperative. Fondesuco was formed mid-90s with the mission of increasing financial inclusion in remote rural areas. And by now it financially serves over 25,000 members. And they describe the climate change context in Peru of melting glaciers, which have downstream effects with flooding, erosion, and rising sea levels. And that had a strong impact on their portfolio, which was a trigger then to go and look at what could be done about it. And to engage with these risks, they had multiple activities that they engaged with, which included new software, an environmental management system, and included also green lending products and non-financial services, also through the use of demonstration farms. So that was the demonstration farms part, was an interesting element of the technical assistance there. From these different approaches, maybe there's something you would like to highlight.
What I found most interesting here was the the demonstration farm that they have. It's almost like they've created a university in good agricultural practices for their clients, and the training has so many different modules on beekeeping, terracing, conservation, hydroponics, greenhouses, worm composting. It's a long list, but really about productivity and good agricultural practices, and that struck me, and also their internal environmental management system. It's really embedded in the organization. We've got some comments, some questions coming through, so let's move on to the last that we're going to talk about here, which is Norandino. This is a cooperative formed in 2005. They had over 22,000 members, also in Peru. The changing environment is similar to just what we talked about, but particularly variations in frequency and intensity of rainfall patterns. In 2016, Norandino, supported by the Hivos Triodos Fund, implemented a credit product called Renovation that is aimed at small coffee growers that are affected by yellow rust, and who demonstrated a willingness to shift to organic agriculture and fair trade programs. There are credit advisors who are trained specifically on rural development processes, and this lending product allows low-cost investments of up to about 1,300 euros to rehabilitate or renew about half an hectare of coffee with a 36-month term, 3 annual installments. Mainly, this product really encourages farmers to diversify by adding trees, crops, and animals to increase food security and soil fertility and conservation. So yeah, Frédéric.
Yeah, you've mentioned quite a few things there already, and I follow you on how I like the description of the broader dynamics, especially for these coffee farmers, showing the link with this climate change, pests and diseases, which then through coffee leaf rust had an impact on coffee farmers. And I also liked how they responded to it. So the idea of a longer-term credit to allow for investments for the renovation of coffee plantations. But there it's important to say that once you renovate, there's different ways of going about it. You can do it with new varietals and go for the input-intensive, technified, modern way of doing coffee production, or choose for the more organic, fair trade way. So here it was interesting for them to have clearly chosen more that path, also with the fair trade element that includes a slightly more collective action approach there. So yeah, I think those elements stood out for me in this case.
Great. So we've got about 7 minutes, Ben. We're going to take a few minutes over, but that's okay. Firstly, I see that Govinda Raut is watching this because he's put comments in the chat. He's the MD of Muktinath. He must have come just from his feed to the ceremony. So you're very welcome, and thanks for being here, and congratulations. We have one question. We'll come back to that one, because first I wanted to ask you, Frédéric, you watched this process very closely last year, and overall, what have been your takeaways from it, either the process or the topic or the 10 organizations we've talked about?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I want to start with a bit of a disclaimer there, in the sense that everything we mentioned about the interesting points and the takeaways are from reading the applications and discussing them. It's sometimes difficult when it's in a context that you're not very familiar with to know how it really translates on the ground. So this is mainly on about the basic principles, some general impressions. The first one I think we mentioned was important, how it opened up to different possible institutions that were different from different years, with the possibility of the NGO and an insurer coming in. I also noticed a high instance of rural and agricultural productive finance, and that's important, especially as it came with a focus on financing more longer-term investments, because often agricultural finance is with working capital, and sometimes for the adaptation or for changing practices, this longer-term investment finance is necessary. This also adds to another point that I see, that a lot of initiatives are focused on staying with your clients in times of trouble. I think we see the resiliency funds, we see investments also for longer terms. And I think that's important, that climate change is making already difficult to reach rural areas even more complicated to engage with. So that's really important to emphasize this idea of increasing the presence and the support for these difficult to reach areas. I also saw that many of these initiatives really came from a lived experience in relation to climate change, and a lot of these institutes said, okay, we had such a big cost on our portfolio, we have to do something. But this can be, I think, really inviting, maybe in general, when there's talks about should financial institutions think about their engagement with the environment or not, or it's still a bit in discussion. But this might show, okay, let's just do it, and preferably in a proactive way, while it's still, while it's still possible to say it in a way. The last point from these takeaways, I think I mentioned before also about some initiatives with a smaller size, but with an impressive breadth of services. For example, there's an initiative with less than 1,000 clients, but seem to have really the tools to go deep into the engagement with the community. And sometimes these kind of initiatives can be seen as difficult to replicate, or maybe not very streamlined, or not very focused. Another tool may seem more easy to scale or already have more clients, but this is really a discussion about upscaling or outscaling. I think these small engaged initiatives can also be very inspiring to see how other practices in other places can take place. Yeah, these would be my points.
Thank you. A couple of questions here. Tamara says, I wonder if one of these MFIs is also supporting the client's resilience by delivering disaster preparedness funding. If that means creating the facilities for, so I think ascii is the closest to that with their resiliency fund. This really encourages, it's a savings product that clients are encouraged to save into, that is triggered by an event. But if it's grant funding to clients that you're talking about, I don't know of examples of that, but there's an interesting response from Bart from Agricord there to cover that. I want to, Frédéric, I want to come back to you on the you wrote a blog earlier this year in which admitting your or conceding that you have an interest with FDL because IOB has worked with them. But you made a broader point there in arguing that while APA was a worthy winner and it's a worthy initiative, you wanted to make a broader point that the direction we should be looking in the sector when we look for initiatives to replicate. Do you want to expand on that a little bit here?
Yeah, definitely, and thanks for the opportunity here to expand on that. So yeah, responding to the award of last year, we wrote a blog and together with Professor Johan Bastiansen, and that was entitled "Urgent Action on Climate Change Must Go Beyond Business as Usual." So that was really the starting point, was the discussion last year about how urgent action is in terms of climate change. And so in this blog, we kind of questioned the extent to which financial services as such can play a role in this, especially if not taking into account the broader picture, and especially when entering primarily with a financial approach to the problem. So that was a bit the entry point. And to be honest, we felt that the final decision on the award was a bit of a missed opportunity to turn the spotlights on maybe sometimes smaller but more complete, in our opinion, and proactive approaches. So I'm glad you also mentioned we do not question the quality of the Winners Initiative as a financial instrument per se. We certainly don't want to dismiss the really pressing concerns that microinsurance tries to address, but what we question is the possible message sent out by focusing on purely microinsurance-based approach. that the urgency of the problem and the higher vulnerability of some groups of people over others really should make us think more in terms of structural challenges and responses. So I wondered whether microinsurance as such points in the direction of these structural changes. And so indeed, we entered a bit more than in a presentation of what FDL does. That's an approach that we know quite well, and we're working together with them to reflect more deeply on what type of activities and types of farmers are being supported. And what I like there is also the openness to go further and think about how financial services relate to broader dynamics of exclusion and deforestation in the agricultural frontier, for example. And that's also in terms of learning how difficult it is to be a financial actor and to question some of the dominant economic practices, which in that case are extensively more input-based than coffee production. But I think the same argument could be made for quite a few of the initiatives that we saw here. We pointed out sometimes about the partnerships, different approaches to financial and non-financial services. So this is mostly because of the background of knowing them well, but it's really about the general idea of, is the entry point mainly a financial product, or is there a broader engagement with the community? So I think that's the key takeaway. Also to question the entry point and the key, how shall I say it, whether the entry point is mainly the financial product, because what we also think was part of the message is that it very much links to the broader financial inclusion movement now, not necessarily putting strongly up front the social and environmental impact, so really questioning or wondering if we cannot be a bit more ambitious at that level to make sure that we don't lose out also the complexity of how you could actually lead to changes in terms of social and environmental impact. Yeah, so I think that would be one of the key points, and in relation to also what this means in terms of engaging with communities and in terms of alliances is the willingness to think outside of only financial services, but the combination of social movements and questioning broader structure.
Well said. I think we're just past time, so I think that's a good place to wrap up. I'd just like to reiterate the point I mentioned at the start, which is that when COVID is over, as it will be, climate change will not be. It'll still be here, and we mustn't let the urgent crowd out the important here and take eyes off this. And I think that this award, played its role and should hopefully have highlighted many of these ideas, because there are fascinating initiatives going on around the world in this, the bigger challenge. Frédéric, I'd like to say thank you for you, not only for joining today, but for preparing for this session so diligently. Thank you, everyone who has come. You will find on the session page the paper from last year, if you would like to download it and read it. I will also post the blog that Frédéric and Johan wrote. I'll post a link to that for people who want to get deeper into that. And I suspect he'd welcome an email if you wanted to argue with him about it. And I hope you enjoyed the rest of European Microfinance Week. And thank you very much for coming. Thanks.
Thank you.
And now, for your comfort and convenience, we have another intermission. We'll come back with more content in 15 minutes.